hi everyone. If you're watching this, you're likely interested in dismantling white supremacy or looking at ways to take an anti-racist approach to decent work. And in this video, it is part of the Decent Pathway that is talking about dismantling white supremacy. I have Danielle and Rob, who are part of the Toronto Neighborhood Centers, and we have been on a journey for quite some time. You know, after as part of the process of revisiting, invigorating, reimagining, re-engaging the Decent Work Charter and Checklist through an anti-racist lens. We did engagement sessions across the nonprofit sector with Black, Indigenous, and racialized workers. And then what manifested from that was a set of recommendations on how to amend and um, yeah, you know what, amend the Decent Work Charter and Checklist to really hone in on an equity and anti-racist lens. And so with those recommendations, as we were integrating them, one of the pieces that came up was, we've done this work before. There's lots of toolkits out there that speak to how to take an anti-racist approach. But there isn't one that clearly outlines or specifically talks about the ways in which white folks can be engaged outside of, the work of showing up for racial justice, of course. And I know that TNC had been in this space for quite some time and thinking through ideas of how to hold white folks accountable. And so this was a great opportunity after we had engaged and taken the wisdom of Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks, was to sit with white folks and sit with the tensions that show up for white folks. And this is, it was somewhat of an experiment. And I guess we're going to talk a bit about what that process looked like, the challenges, the opportunities, as well as the growth edges. And so I'll let Danielle and Rob introduce themselves and talk a bit about the dismantling white supremacy community of practice that you folks put together, how it came to be, and then we'll dive into talk about decent work and the work that we did around the charter, as well as the pathways, as it's now affectionately called.
Sounds good. Do you want to start, Danielle? Or do you want me to?
No, go for it. Yeah, you go
Okay.
ahead.
Well, I'm Rob Howarth. I'm the co-executive director of the Toronto Neighborhood Centers with my colleague Sri Nalamathu. This has been an expansive and long journey. The actual dismantling white supremacy piece is part of a broader canvas of a number of affinity groups across our Toronto Neighborhood Centers network, which is an association of, I guess, 26 social service agencies in Toronto. And we pulled together affinity groups around rainbow work with LGBTQ staff and people who wanted to work on those issues. We pulled together stuff around disability justice, BIPOC affinity group. So there were a lot of spaces that work was going on in. What we wanted at the beginning for the white leaders and staff and passionate people in the sector was a space. I think we called it, we were tentative. We didn't want to call it allies. I think we called it, what was the title, Danielle?
Of this last iteration?
Not the last one, the very first one where we dipped our toe in the water. This was like 3 years ago before, I think it was before COVID. Aspiring allies, I think.
Aspiring allies, that's
we
right.
didn't want to
Yeah.
presume that we had the capacity to be good allies. That was so interesting. I think it was the first space where we wrestled with how do we call white people in and what container or strategy do we use to do that? And how do we do that without recentering whiteness, our own dynamics? And is it really a good idea to get a bunch of white people together to talk about how to dismantle white supremacy? Is that really going to work? Because
The honesty.
That seems a little problematic.
Right.
Anyway,
And
jump in,
right.
Danielle.
Yeah, well, right. And also we need to.
Yes,
we need to talk about it and then also not cause harm. So how do we in being honest with all the blind spots and all of the like sticky mess of that work that doesn't have a lot of space, that is intentionally there isn't space for, to wrestle with that tension, and either do we meet just as a group of white folks, or is this a mixed group, and how to negotiate that. And there's been like 3 or 4 iterations since that first group. And just to introduce myself, my name's Danielle, and I work at 2 of the 26 agencies that Rob mentioned that TNC supports, and been connected since the last role that I played. And yeah, have been at a couple of the different iterations over that time. And it's been a real journey. There's been a lot of really interesting changes from that first group that you mentioned, to conversation circles that were really beautiful, kind of centered in restorative justice practices. There was this last iteration, which was inspired by a Surge video called "Calling White People In," that started about a year ago now across the different agencies. So we've been really trying to wrestle with this and continue to figure out ways to meet and grow and learn together. Yeah.
So I think the listening circle stuff you mentioned, Danielle, that was almost 2 years ago now, I think. And it was very intentionally white and Black and staff of color, racialized staff. It wasn't, and then we did pieces of it in caucusing in different groups and then coming back together. So we've played a lot. It's really, I feel like, more of a dance. It's not an off the shelf, here's the strategy on how you can do this. And that's why the latest iteration, I think, has been so lovely, because it was rich in the decent work and racialized justice space. The work that the BIPOC staff did, and the another piece off to the side with TNC of the BIPOC leadership energies, but the decent work that was done to then have, like, so Danielle and I had been stewarding this Calling White People In space to try to invite people, white staff in organizations, and we refer to all of the staff as white leaders or bringing leadership, not as senior leaders, but whatever position of leading and participating they can bring in their organization. So we were holding that space. So I guess after the initial uncertainty, we just began to realize there were some necessities of this space that we needed. But it needed to be it still was an open space, and anybody was invited to come. So it wasn't excluding anyone who didn't identify as white. And that was important to us. And we had other staff come who were not, so it wasn't always just white folks around.
But hopefully the way that we framed those meetings let people know what they were in for. What kind of conversations, where we were trying to unpack, like what we were trying to explore together.
I remember coming to a couple of them and sitting in just to get a sense of what you folks were doing. And I found them really helpful in the sense that often we hear, that notion of, white folks do the work around anti-racism, don't put the labor on, Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks. And this was that space to really actually do the labor and figure it out, and sit with the tensions. And I know I wasn't at every session, but what I found so interesting about that space was the commitment of sitting in the unknown, but that being part of the process and the continuation of the work. And, whether it was the topical discussions you've had or the more like practical pieces around like EDI work within the neighborhood centers. So I just wanted to make mention of that.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I also that this particular iteration or this particular group feels really important to me, because we tried to strip away a lot of the structure that normally gets put into place for these kind of spaces. That first iteration, the Aspiring Allies group, that was like 2019, like pre-pandemic even times, had a really formal meeting structure, like a formal agenda and a formal hierarchy of who's holding the space. And And then with the listening circles, which are very powerful and have a lot of applications in different ways, is a very structured space with some readings and a lot of support and holding to have those small group discussions. Whereas this, you really wanted to almost completely move away from all that, not to not be careful, but to really just be together and use some different prompts, but be like not 10 or 15 minutes max of that content, and then it just be loose for conversation and to stay with what comes up and not try to protect ourselves by over structuring the environment, if that makes any sense.
That's beautiful. And so that led to an invitation to engage with not only the Dismantling White Supremacy Community of Practice, but also some of O&M's network members to discuss the pathways around decent work, specifically because there was the lens of including racial justice and equity and what that meant. But what that particularly meant for implementation, because as we know, we are in a current state where you know, time has passed. There's equity folks that are often embedded in organizations. There's human resources staff, or if there isn't, there's folks that take on that specific role. And at times, there's this process of getting stuck, which often stops the sustainability or prevents the work from being sustainability. And I know I said this to you both, that a lot of that work is behavioral. And in the sector, as you pointed to, Danielle, there is an over-reliance on the agenda and on the process and putting it in a neat package. So where do you folks want to start? Do you want me to just talk a bit about your experiences the first couple of sessions? Or do you want me to like go in a bit more in terms of the pathways and what we were hoping?
Well, I can just say that having the invitation from the work that had been done by Black and Indigenous and racialized staff on the decent work agenda and kind of reinvigorating it, as you mentioned, Yami, was very grounding. You know, I mean, that's the kind of sort of confidence that we then as white participants in the sector and leaders in the sector, you know, we have some direction. And so that's a
Yeah.
very, very important. And so it was a really valuable and beautiful space to be in with other white leaders. Again, I'm using leaders. I need a better word for it, but you know,
White
people,
folks in the sector.
white folks in the sector. Thank you.
Yeah.
Who want to step into this work, and also, I think we were invited to do is puzzle out on behalf of other white folks in the sector what's helped us connect to this agenda, what's helped us sustain this, and how could we add to the decent work space in a way that would create this momentum for other white folks in the sector to pick this up in a continued way. So that was really a great request, and it was a very dynamic and wonderful group to experience. And it was in real time. Again, it's learning as we go.
Yeah.
I was really fascinated by some of the kind of momentum of some of our discussions, and even those seem to, in a small scale, repeat some of the patterns that you've noted already, Yami, where it's we're convening the keeners, and people are very excited. There's a lot of energy. There's a lot of anticipation and commitment. But then it also gets confusing, and it can get hard, and it can feel overwhelming, or it can get ground down into, oh, this is just too hard, because what are we going to do with all the people who aren't here, or all the people who need to convince that aren't convinced? Or there's these large looming pieces that get thrown in, and the kind of energy gets eroded, and it's, what do you do then? And I think, Danielle, you had some really great kind of prompts or ways of shifting in those instances.
And maybe if I could slow us down a little bit just to give folks who are watching this video a bit of context of how it went down. So, as
Thank
I
you.
mentioned, we had been convening Black, Indigenous, and racialized workers to give feedback on decent scheduling, decent wages, all of the pathways that you've likely clicked on before this video. Um, and then we invited uh, white folks in the sector from different organizations to respond to where they were seeing tensions or where they would get stuck. Because this work is important, and the energy that, the feedback that we got was so critical. And often there is um, uh, a stalling that happens. I shouldn't say often, there can be a stalling that happens. And so we wanted to experiment with that piece. And so we invited folks first and to talk in group form with each other around why decent work matters to them, why from a racial justice, and did some group forming around that. Subsequently, after that, we began to engage in conversations around dismantling white supremacy and what that looked like on a practical HR level, looking at the pathways. And then we pivoted because we realized that the behavioral components to engaging with the pathways, which truly can be applied to anyone, but we took a lens where we wanted to speak directly to folks who hold privilege in these contexts, or at times hold privilege, and based on the identities of white privilege, recognizing that there are intersectionalities and whatnot. So we didn't want to beat around the bush. So we asked the questions around what are some thoughts, what are some behaviors, what are some principles that can support folks in moving through the pathways. And so we pivoted with that. And then we came up with a number of principles, which you can click on and refer to outside of this pathway. But it was really important for us to talk about the process, because the process actually illuminated to us the very challenges that show up in organizations. And so, with that, I'll hand it over to you, Danielle, to go into more detail and about the challenges that showed up in these three key areas. So, the three key areas that we're going to kind of address is the challenges of group forming around anti-racism when the work gets overwhelming, and what to do and how to slow down when things get tough. And then the third theme that we're going to be discussing in this video is the sustainability and how to keep the work going, and continue that momentum, because it's quite literally a pathway, it's a journey, it's ongoing. So I'll stop there and hand it over to you, Danielle, to share more about, the first challenge, the theme that showed up around the challenges of group forming.
Yeah, I think like we talked about this in reflection, and like serious props to you for really naming that the process and pulling back and having that like meta perspective is really what needed to happen to build the principles out and to like recognize the patterned behaviors that always show up in these spaces. Like nothing, a lot of that isn't new, right? And really at all. And so how to like look at that and point at that and actually name it a bit more explicitly was really necessary, and I think will really hopefully make this work really meaningful to people, that they can engage with it more honestly in that way. I think so. In terms of like group forming or like the challenges, I think there are also classic challenges of group forming that it's a lot of folks who challenges and opportunities. A lot of folks who don't really know each other very well, right? Even us, right? We haven't all worked together before. And we were like, we had a couple really exciting, inspired meetings before the sessions because we're passionate about this work and want to see this turn into something awesome. And then all the people who came, right, were also people who are very passionate, are the ones who are showing up to these kind of spaces. And we haven't all worked together before. And so there's those like just really kind of classic do I feel safe here? Do I belong here? Is there space for all of me here? And then also not letting that get in the way of like actually getting down to the deeper questions and um, looking at the information that was being presented from the Black leaders that had already come before, the Black staff that were engaged and had given really clear and direct feedback about what would work and what needs to change. Yeah, Rob, what would you add about, or would you add anything about that? About forming or challenges to forming?
It was a pretty keen group, so I think the forming
Mhm.
could happen quickly, but I guess in all of these situations, there's no substitute for time together
Yeah,
and building trust through exploring things, and supporting one another to create a container that just encourages intimacy and honesty. And I think that,
yeah,
everybody knew that, but you can't just snap your fingers and have it happen. So you need to be aware in a process that that's part of what you're trying to do together. And there's no guidebook for exactly how that's to be done. It's like human beings being good with one another and trying to create some lovely patterns if they can in relationships.
I think that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, yeah, I appreciate the way you frame that. And I think that shaped some of the principles in that section, right, around how important relationship is. That that it can be messy, or that you don't always have to agree to keep moving something forward. Like those are the ones that stand out for me that I think were also really informed by the forming process.
And I think what's really interesting about the group forming process as a witness to the engagement sessions that we had was that we actually needed to slow down.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
Too often, because I think, yes, folks did not know each other, but there was a mirroring of what it could look like within organizations. And um, just thinking about how time is not often spent for that relational piece. And it's like, okay, we're creating an anti-racism strategy, or okay, we're getting into the pathways. Let's dive in. And there's this component of, hold on, who's in the room?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's going on for them, and using the community guidelines, but beyond that, actually asking the questions of how do you understand white supremacy,
Mhm.
right? What is your understanding of decent work? What is your understanding of equity? Because I think too often there's assumptions that are made that we're actually all on the same page, because of popular rhetoric when
Yeah.
we're not, and different contexts call for different things. So that piece of group forming really illuminated that need to slow down and get to know who's in the space, and also get to know the shared understandings, I think.